Hello everyone, Margie right here again. I just wanted to talk about my own personal favorite setting in D&D. One that I love to play in and one that I'd love to run a campaign in at some point. Once I get this homebrew campaign done, I've been running for 3.5 years, but we'll talk about that later. But my personal setting that I think is the most interesting setting in D&D is Eberron. Eberron is a D&D setting that was created during 3.5 D&D, and it was created by Keith Baker, Bill Slavazek, and James Wyatt. I apologize if I pronounced any of those names incorrectly, but it is a very interesting setting that takes a lot of the more traditional ideas of D&D high fantasy and subverts some of them, makes some more extreme, and adds some new stuff to the way you think of a high fantasy D&D game. Eberron isn't quite a traditional setting. It's a little bit more of an arcane punk setting compared to, say, Tolkien high fantasy or Forgotten Realms. There are some technology advances in Eberron. It's very high magic, as in most people in the world do have magic or can use some kind of low-level magic. But it's in its own little bubble, removed from a lot of other D&D settings. So the rules are different there. There's an entirely new pantheon. There's an entirely new creation myth for how the world was made, which involved 3 dragons. And the way that a lot of traditional D&D races are portrayed is very different. Another thing they do is they added a lot of races to D&D that didn't exist before. They are available now in Eberron Rising from the Last War, which is the 5th edition setting book for Eberron. They added changelings, which are people who can physically change their form, which means they don't use magic, and it isn't an illusion, so it can't be seen through. The downside is they can't change foes, but very interesting characters, really good for a variety of uses, and they are, in the Eberron setting, they are mostly spies and are in some way descended, I think, from doppelgangers, but very interesting race that a lot of people have taken from that setting and put in other settings. The other options are Warforged, who were created during this big war in Eberron, and they are basically magical robots. They have a metal and wood body with an arcane core, which gives them the semblance of a soul, sort of, and allows them to be healed with divine magic. And they are incredibly interesting, and they have this backstory involving the war. And now that this giant war in Eberron is over with, they are just trying to find purpose for their lives in this after-war world. So they have this interesting built-in backstory with them, which is very cool. Another one that they added in Eberron are shifters. Shifters are kind of half-human, half-animal folk, without being a full animal, like, say, a loxodon or a lizard folk. They are like a mix of a human and an animal. And they can take on more animal characteristics when they're in combat. And they're very interesting, and one that I don't think gets a lot of attention in the D&D community, but are very cool. And then the last one that Eberron Rising from the Last War added to D&D 5e was the Kalashtar. And Kalashtar are complicated to explain, but they are psionic-y humans who have a person or a spirit in their head who kind of guides them. And there's a lot of lore explanation for Kalashtar, but they are also an incredibly interesting, very deep race that I think has a lot of potential for a character in D&D. They've added those 4 races, and then they also made changes to a lot of races that already existed in D&D. They changed how orcs are usually portrayed. In Eberron, orcs generally come from a primeval forest where they are druids trying to understand the forest that they live in. A lot of orcs in Eberron are druids. It's very interesting. And then there's an entire nation of monster races that are trying to get respect from the humanoid races in Eberron. There's an entire nation that worships the dead. There's an entire nation of basically religious crusaders. Elves are all on their own in a very insular society where they don't like outsiders, and dragons are very involved in the setting, but they're also very removed from normal people living in Eberron. But on the other hand, there's all these groups called the Dragon Mark Houses, which are these organizations of basically mafia families, but who have made themselves very important to the infrastructure of Eberron and the running of the general society day to day, but are very secretive and have their own insular societies that you can't come into unless you are a dragon marked person yourself, which is a marking you have on your body that gives you special abilities. And you have airships, you have trains, there's an entire city that's ginormous and many, many levels tall and called the Sharn, the City of Towers. And like I said, there's a whole primeval forest where all these orcs are druids trying to study it. And there's a whole area that after the war was completely rendered almost unlivable for most people except for Warforged. And there's all these feral Warforged wandering around in this creepy, misty area. And there's a whole area where halflings ride dinosaurs. It's crazy, but it's so interesting. And I think that literally you could throw a dart at a map of the world and start an adventure there, and it would be incredibly interesting. So yeah, I think that Eberron is personally my favorite setting in D&D. I like lots of other settings. I think they all have their pros and cons. I'm sure Eberron has some cons, but maybe I haven't played it enough to find out what the cons are yet. But I think it has the potential to be very interesting, and a lot of stuff is set for you as a DM, but a lot of stuff is also left up to you so that you can decide what you want to take and what you want to add, and a lot of stuff is left open so that you can make it your own. You don't have to deal with the after-war stuff. You don't have to deal with any of that stuff. You could set your stuff during the war. You could set your stuff before the war even started. You could set your stuff 100 years after the war has been done if you wanted to, and see how the world has changed. But the world always feels very lived in and very developing. So I highly recommend it. At least give it a try. At least look into it and see if it's interesting to you. But yeah, that is my personal favorite setting in D&D. And I'd like to know what yours is. If you have a setting in D&D that you enjoy, please let me know. I'd love to hear it in the comments. But that's all from me today. I'd like to thank you for watching. If you can, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.